Welcome back. A couple minutes later, but we're still back here at the Weather and Climate Summit here in Breckenridge, Colorado. It's nice and sunny outside, but boy, is it cold. Had some new snow yesterday too, which was pretty awesome, anywhere from 3 to 7 inches. Well, we're now have at the time of our panel discussion where we have online viewers that have some questions and also some folks here in the room. Since I have the microphone first, I'm going to ask a question, and I suspect this one would be more for perhaps Tony or Eileen, and that is, we've seen a lot of changes going on in the U.S. with regard to annual mean temperatures, things warming up. Is there any particular area in the United States that you feel is more vulnerable than others when it comes to infrastructure or being threatened more for storms, perhaps along the coast? Is there any particular area of the U.S. that seems to be more threatened right now than the others?
Dave, one of the things that we found in these various assessments, because that's a common question, is that the way that different parts of the country are vulnerable is simply different in different parts of the country. So there are lots of water management issues, here in the West, and we talked about some of the forest pest issues. But the flip side of that is that in parts of the country, particularly in the Gulf Coast and up the East Coast, where there's a lot of infrastructure, sort of the built environment, cities, towns, roads, transportation infrastructure, along the coast, it's really quite vulnerable to rising sea level. And so it's not so much that one part of the country is more or less vulnerable than another. It's just that the vulnerabilities are different depending on what resources are there, what kind of investment there is, and which part of the climate system is really the most important there.
And do you find any cities or towns along the coastline already moving to make decisions that are based on impacts 20, 25, 30 years from now?
Eileen talked about one just this morning.
Yeah, I think that the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, Lewis, Delaware was one of the first cities to actually develop a climate adaptation plan. Their primary issue was sea level rise. There are a number of towns throughout New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island who have begun to take actions, some of them limited, some of them not. I mentioned the Deer Park sewage treatment plant outside of Boston. So there are a lot of little examples, and I think I'd love to have the slides. I can get back to you so you can put it on the website. But there are a large number of states who've already adopted climate adaptation plans and an awful lot of cities. There has been a city leader environmental initiative, an international initiative for a long time. It has a U.S. presence now that is extremely strong. There's an NGO called ICLEI, I-C-L-E-I, which doesn't stand for anything anymore because it used to be International City Leaders Environmental Initiative. But they have, if you just go to their website, you'll find a lot of examples of cities and towns that have taken this seriously.
So would it be safe to assume that some of these cities are treating climate change as a crisis, or is it just something that they're really just having to address because changes are happening?
I don't know that any of them have approached it as a crisis, but they have approached it as we're investing in infrastructure. One of the most interesting things about this time in the United States in particular is how much of our very expensive infrastructure has aged to the point where we need to replace it, whether it's airports, it's water distribution systems, it's port facilities along the coast. So we're at a really opportune time for these cities and communities to begin to factor changing climate conditions in, and that's what's happening. What they're thinking about is, what's the cost of taking action now versus the cost of recovering if we don't take action now? And a lot of these cities and communities are feeling that it's more cost effective to act, not specifically for any individual crisis that might be coming, but a sense that we're seeing enough change to be concerned about it and we want to take some action. That's what happened in King County, Washington, for example.
Okay. And we have an online question. Sarah Maxwell is going to ask that question.
Yes, this question comes from Justin Adams in Paducah, Kentucky. He's working on West Africa and Equatorial Guinea, Cameroon, and he said it's hard for him to find historical weather data to create a hazard vulnerability analysis for operations. And he's wondering if you had any advice for him on where he can get more information.
He can try that the Climate Mapper product that I put up. That's going to be a mix of ground data and satellite data. But that's one of the challenges to working in many parts of the developing world, is that there's not good local records of historical weather. There is a facility based in Niger that has, I think, 100 years worth of data, but it's on microfiche, and we're going to be trying to work with them to get it digitized. But that's one of the challenges to doing this and to developing good forecasts and projections, because there is such a paucity of historical data.
Hi, Cindy Pressler from St. Louis. My question involves river flooding. It seems like it's becoming more prevalent year by year. We've been dealing with it more and more since I've been living in the St. Louis area, last year in particular. Do you see that becoming even worse down the road, or are we going to have more droughts up in that part of the country, and maybe that will alleviate that? And also the problems with the levee systems along the Mississippi and the Missouri River. They had to blow some of those up. That created problems with the farmers in that area. So flooding, river flooding in general.
One of the really interesting phenomena when you look at the output of climate models, and you're starting to see this in the historical data as well, is that there is a tendency in a lot of these model projections to have more extremes. So you actually have sort of more intense rainfall and more droughts in the same simulation. Whether or not that results in floods is in part a matter of how the river system is actually managed, but it's also a function of whether you're getting this, you really start getting this phenomenon of really early snow melts, or the particularly bad situation of rain on snow, and then the whole thing coming down. There's certainly been indications in the historical record that the frequency of those kind of events has increased over the past 50 years, and it's been a huge challenge.
It's Adaptation, Oklahoma City. Shows some of the pictures of the pine beetle damage, and I'm wondering how much, has anyone done any work on trying to tease out the climate signal from that? How much of this is related to climate change? How much is related to the natural PDO swings, or just the high latitude warming we're seeing in North America?
There's some work from the U.S. Forest Service, from the Canadian Forest Service, on some of those points. I don't think I've seen a result that's tried to tease out the PDO effect from the sort of longer term effect of warmer winters. But it is a complicated story. Those stands, particularly for lodgepole pine in Canada, are much more even-aged than they would naturally be. That's a legacy of economic forestry and replanting programs. So they're even age. There's more lodgepole pine than there ordinarily would be. So it is this interaction of change in the climate system, change in how the forests have been managed, and the sort of this long shadow of how these forests were managed 50, 60, 70 years ago that end up producing this phenomenon that has certainly got a strong climate component, but has all these other components as well.
If I could just add a little bit to that, the other interesting area to me of research is how is the long-term trend in temperature change globally? How is that affecting those natural patterns of variability? Because you and I aren't really going to feel the long-term trend. We're going to feel what happens in how it's manifested in weather and acute problems like drought or flooding. Well, what does that temperature change mean for the PDO? Is it influencing the PDO? Is it influencing ENSO? Is it influencing the North Atlantic Oscillation? Some of the conversation earlier this week that things were not typical, that the impacts we expect to see are not actually happening in all areas. Well, why is that? And is there a climate change long-term trend signal in what's happening to natural variability? That's a really active area of research, and for me it's particularly interesting because of the fact that that's what we adapt to, is what we see from year to year or from season to season.
Paul Goodlow, Weather Channel. I know here in Summit County the pine bark beetle is a huge problem, but it seems as though some of the other species now are taking over. Is that a way to mitigate the problem?
I'm sorry, I guess I don't understand, Paul. You mean other tree species, you mean?
Right.
Well, it doesn't mitigate the problem of what happens to the lodgepole pine, and so you've got this increased fire risk. Over the long term, it's certainly possible that you'll see replacement of that species by other tree species. The long-term effects of that on everything from water flow to habitat would be very difficult to speculate on. But the biggest challenge is, how do you get through this period of a decade or two while you're in this messy transition? That's where the big adaptation challenge is right now.
We have another online question. Sarah Maxwell is going to ask that. Go ahead, Sarah.
This one comes from Bob Berwin from Frisco, Colorado, right here locally. He was wondering if there's any apparent trend toward declining snowpacks in the Rocky Mountains.
I don't know. Do you know the answer to that? I haven't looked at the data for here. I guess I should have done that before I got on the plane. I'm sorry. I don't know, but I'll bet other people here do know.
Yeah, this is Dale Eck. It's ever since I've been coming out here and skiing, I do watch year to year, and there's been I think it's kind of in you get the cycles more, and I think the idea, maybe the extremes, the end, you're seeing more occasionally a year that it's really down and scarily down, and in other years you go through 2 or 3 years where the actual snowfalls are hitting record levels. So
like
I
last
think
year.
right now it's a little bit of both. I had actually, and this relates to, and I know we had our talk that La Nina, El Nino are not the only signals that drive this kind of thing. And one of the ski resorts asked me to take a look because we were heading into a La Nina. So could they use that as a marketing? Look, we're going into this pattern, and when we get these patterns, we get a lot of snow. And what actually the data showed was that neutral is best for this area to get snow. It's when you get a strong El Nino or a strong La Nina that you get the bigger, either less snow kind of thing.
But this is also a really interesting point, is that what you would expect to see with these long-term changes in the physical climate system is not that each year is slightly warmer than the next, or that each year there's a little less snow than there was previously. It doesn't mean the end of winter. You're still going to have a lot of natural variability. These interannual cycles, ENSOs, La Ninas, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and so forth. But superimposed on that is this longer-term trend, which you see it when you look at very long time series of data, and that's really why these long records are so important to have.
Matt Safino from Portland. To follow up on Dale's comments and also the question from the online guy in Frisco, I think the Climate Impacts Group at University of Washington has done some work on the long-term snowpack, given a warming climate situation, and what their research, and you'd have to go online and check this out, shows, though, is that what they're concerned about is not necessarily less precipitation, but more of it falling as rain, at least in the Cascades and the ranges of the West Coast, because then we're getting less snowpack at lower elevations where there's more real estate anyway. And I think the Europeans have also done some work on that as well.
Right, and a lot of my colleagues in the Pacific Northwest National Lab have been part of those studies, done similar studies for the state of Washington, and it really is this balance between what comes down as rain and what comes down as snow that creates a lot of these water management challenges.
And then Dale brought up the interesting point of marketing La Nina, and I've seen a lot of that anyway in the Northwest, both up at Whistler and at the ski areas on Mount Hood, where the marketers are all over it, like, La Nina's back, it's going to be a great season, increase season ticket sales. Exactly.
Welcome back, La Nina.
Right. So that's definitely happening. The thing that I am curious about, the response of and opinions of people in the room, is here for us as communicators. the challenge for us, I think, for a lot of us, is we still have, or we all have people in our markets who think that climate change is a hoax. And so the challenge, and it's our job, part of our job, to not alienate any of our viewers. And so it's a interesting, and we've talked about this at this conference before, it's an interesting question as to how we approach that, because as speakers, you don't necessarily have that, you know, you can dismiss them with a wave of a hand. We can't.
Right.
And so we have to be very careful as to how we talk about this subject. And, you know, what is it? Because while, you know, you had this, for instance, you gave us this handout with all of these records from 2011 of warmest and wettest years on record. Well, you know what? In Portland, Oregon, we had the record fewest number of 60-degree days in 2011. And so the skeptics would say, we're not seeing it here. It's all part of the PDO and the oscillations that we're seeing on a multi-decadal time scale. So we have to be careful how we talk about the subject at this point.
I think that's right. You know, one of the things that at least I've found personally, and I probably give, you know, 30 or so talks like this every year to a wide variety of audiences, is that if somebody asks, you know, why do you believe in climate change? One of the first things I say is that, you know, science is not a faith-based enterprise. You know, you don't believe because it's sort of in your value system. You believe because you've seen the data, you've looked at the data, you know, you've looked at studies that have been extensively reviewed, and that what you see makes sense from a physical perspective, and for a lot of the work that I do and that I'm interested in from an ecological perspective. And, you know, science is always subject to revision and change, but you can't, you know, there's no more skeptical community than a community of scientists. You know, you've got to show people. And so it's, what I try to do at least is talk to people about, this is how science works, is that you've got to have you've got to actually have the data and have a system that allows you to check what you think you know, theories and models, against what you actually observe.
I would add, when you're looking at it from an adaptation perspective, at a certain level, it doesn't really matter what's driving the changes. If your crops are failing and your basement is full of water, you're not going to say, well, it's okay, because I don't think it was climate change. You're going to say, I'm going to be hungry or all my stuff is getting ruined, and I wish it would stop. And so I think at a certain level, you need to look at the impact and deal with that. And if you don't believe in one driver or another, at a certain level, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I wanted to reinforce that. In many ways, the conversations that I have actually don't start with climate at all. They actually start with what's keeping you up at night, water resource manager, what's keeping you up at night, airport operator, and you begin to learn how to find the climate signals in that, and always using the observed data of what's actually happening, and you can see a trend. And I really stay away from what's causing that change until somebody decides that they want to talk about it in the room. But it's usually what's actually happening, what are we observing, how has that change manifested itself here in this place, and then you talk about, well, what do you think we could do about it? Let's try to think about what do we know as scientists and what do you know as a resource manager can help deal with those impacts. I had an example in the first national assessment. The guy who ran the Hawaii Visitor Bureau was a former hotelier from Kauai. He did not want to be part of this assessment because he saw it as a political move by a Democratic administration to try and shove down the throats of the American public that something terrible is happening. And we got him to stay in the room long enough for the first 3 meetings. And what happened is he began to talk about his experiences with hurricanes and how he began to notice that during El Nino years, it was really bad for hurricanes in Hawaii. So we began to talk about natural variability, and ultimately he stayed with us, and he's been one of the best public speakers about the results of the assessment, because it comes right back down to personal experience and the data. I also think that I have much better luck when I talk about it's the data that I'm premising my assessment of risk on. And it isn't an issue of belief. It's a risk assessment. And when I look at the evidence for me as a person, I believe the risk is high that we are probably influencing what's happening. And so I'm willing to take more action than somebody else will. But when you take it away from it's an environmental crisis to this is a choice about how we live, it's a development choice, it's about making sure that our economic sectors and our communities are going to thrive in the future, then you begin to lessen the concern about the politics of it. And I think you probably face this much more than we do, but every one of us, I would guarantee you that every one of us tailors our talks to the audience we're speaking to because we don't want to get into that morass.
This is an excellent discussion. What we're going to do, just for a second, for those of you online, we've gotten some tweets and some information that the video is a little bit jittery on their end. So all we're going to do is stop the stream just for about 10 seconds.
Are you sure it's not us, Dave?
Yeah. Are we jittery?
Okay, we're back. Thanks for sticking with us. Just in case, if you guys want any
Thank you.
water, you can have some water. Have a couple of bottles. I wanted to resume the discussion with, there were some questions over here. Jennifer Francis from Rutgers.
Right. So I wanted to continue the discussion about the snow, just to add a little more information to that. Dave Robinson's laboratory at Rutgers University called the Global Snow Lab has been monitoring snow cover over the Northern Hemisphere for decades. It was based on satellite information and surface observations. And he's finding very clearly that snow cover over the Northern Hemisphere in general has been increasing overall, most likely because of increasing water vapor in the atmosphere that's connected with increasing temperatures. However, there's a very distinct downward trend in the spring months, and that goes to what Tony was talking about, how the snow cover is melting earlier in the spring, and it's a very, very robust trend throughout the Northern Hemisphere. And this has also been connected up with a feedback involving land temperatures and air temperatures following the spring, because as that snow melts earlier, it exposes the soil to the sun in the spring when the sun is at its maximum intensity. That dries out the soil, allows it to warm up sooner, and that effect has actually been linked up with the heat extremes in Europe and also possibly in Texas these last couple of years. So I just wanted to toss that out as some additional information. I also have a question. I live in a small seacoast town in Massachusetts, and one of the adaptation measures that we've been exposed to are the new FEMA 100-year flood maps. And I believe they go into effect this month. Our town is, under the new laws, is about half of it is going to be under the new 100-year flood maps. And there have been two very distinct responses of our community. One is outrage. They have been very, very upset because people live within that range.
The other is there's been a flurry of building activity right before the law went into effect. So my question is whether this is a problem or an issue that you've been seeing up and down the East Coast and perhaps elsewhere in the United States, and it seems
It's all yours.
to be an issue of people not really understanding the point.
Yeah, that's part of it. But I also think that oftentimes we as federal agencies in particular forget the individual human impact of something. I mean, it's fine to sit in Washington and decide we're going to redo the maps and we're going to incorporate a new estimate of 500-year or 100-year floods, but without talking to the community. FEMA actually did go out this time and did some public hearings, but the reality is it's your property. You're going to devalue my property, and what the hell are you doing? Why should the government be doing this? But on the other hand, the flip side of that coin is if the government doesn't provide the evidence that you are at more risk, then suddenly when your house gets washed away, you're going to be challenging the federal government for not having done enough. So this is a real balance between local government, individual property rights, and the role of the federal government. FEMA has been working for years on these revisions and has been reluctant to issue the new maps because they know this reaction will occur, but they felt that now the evidence is sufficient to say we have to do this. So I'd say part of that's an educational activity, both educating the FEMA officials as well as educating communities and individual property owners.
So Eileen's pointed out this is a really interesting dilemma. It's a very hard public policy problem, but everybody doesn't get their own physics. Right? The sea level is still rising. There is more water. There is more storm surge damage, and there's more, and there's more frequency of flooding. So in fact, the frequency of 100-year floods has changed. Sooner or later, you have to acknowledge that in how we actually manage our property and how we actually manage the landscape.
There's a question over here, Brad Panovich from Charlotte, North Carolina. We had a discussion the other night about dinner about Europe moving away from mitigation into more adaptation. Do you think the United States is going that route as well? And maybe that's an easier sell to the public as far as communicating these threats?
That's a very good question. I'd love to know what the results of your own discussion about it were over dinner, particularly because that was probably a more lively discussion.
Yes, it was.
I will give you my own personal perspective on this one, not speaking for NOAA, but for a long time when we were dealing with how do we mitigate through reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, there really was a tendency not to talk about adaptation because you didn't want to give up the fight. Right? The communities who were really concerned about this as a major issue, development issue, environmental issue, economic issue, really wanted to focus on getting countries, nations to commit to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I think what's happened over the last 10 years or 12 to 15 years is reality has sunk in. And even the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recommendations for emissions and then Kyoto Protocol, we would still have to adapt, even if every nation decided that they were going to go along with them, because they're not really that strong. Even if we went to zero, we'd still have to adapt. And I think that's what's happened is that as a community, we've come to realize that while we can continue to say mitigation and adaptation are both important, what we're now saying is they are both important, and we have to adapt to what's actually happening.
And I would add that another factor in that, I guess I'm not going to actually answer your question, but I'll comment on it. The emissions from the developing world have grown dramatically in the last 10 or 12 years, and where emissions in Europe and the United States and Japan and Australia are leveling off, growing more slowly, they're growing very rapidly in the developing world, and the lion's share of emissions over the next 20 or 30 years are expected to come from rapidly growing economies in the developing world. And so our ability the United States and Europe and Japan's ability to influence global emissions is also getting diminished. So while I think we should do something, our share of the overall total is smaller and is going to continue to decrease. China is now the biggest emitter. India is growing rapidly, and so our ability to influence the overall picture is shrinking.
Yeah. John Morales from NBC Miami. Yeah, just to follow up, I was in on that conversation, and it was initiated because I just came back from a forum in Europe, in Paris, where there were many broadcast meteorologists present, and the presentations were from many of the scientists and even local government representatives from around France. And in the case of France, and I believe this is the case of the entire European Union, you're right. They seem to have given up on the 2-degree centigrade goal. They seem to realize that is just simply not attainable anymore because this train is almost unstoppable. So they're shifting to adaptation, and it is a seismic shift from where things were, I'd say, even just a half a decade ago over in Europe. So I find it very interesting because that really dovetails into what you said earlier, Eileen, regarding adaptation is going to happen at the local level. We're not going to be able to depend on the national governments around the world, or for that matter, a global effort to mitigate enough, because there's just no political will to do so. And therefore, adaptation probably needs to happen at the local level. I think Mayor Bloomberg has said a lot along those lines as well. I guess I don't really have a question. It was just a comment on the conversation that we had shared the other night, but you're certainly welcome to comment on that.
No, it's a great addition to the debate, and it's not going to go away. What's interesting is when communities decide that they're going to couple adaptation with energy efficiency, or energy conservation, or water conservation. You'll start to see the impacts on greenhouse gas emissions when they make those commitments. California is a great example, at least in the previous administration, when they were actually trying to do energy efficiency standards that were much stronger at the same time that they were talking about adaptation. So you'll begin to see it, I think, for other reasons, non-climate reasons. It'll be to save energy, to reduce costs, to be more efficient. So I think you'll see the emissions go down, but it's not going to be because a local community has made a decision that that's their goal. Their goal is thrivability as a community.
I think this also points out that one of the real challenges of adaptation as a decision and as a process is in a sense generating the knowledge of what it is you're trying to adapt to, so that this iterative process of making a decision, seeing how it works, making another decision, actually begins to reap you some benefits. And so I think this continued investment in actually understanding how these different parts of the world interact with each other, the climate system, what kinds of services you want out of the landscape, where you're going to put infrastructure, understanding how those interactions actually work in the real world becomes enormously important, especially when people start talking about adaptation decisions. There's no one decision that you make today that's going to last for the next 50, 75, 100 years, but there's going to be a whole series of decisions that people and communities make, and you want each one to be marginally better than the last.
A question here for the panel, and really I'd like to know what the rest of the room thinks about this as well. One thing I've noticed when I get questions from the public is they want to ascribe one cause to something. How do we tackle that? How do you tackle it? How does everyone else notice that as well?
Sure, simple.
You mean other than saying next question, please?
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, you notice this. How do we educate the public that Earth system science is more than just finding the cause of one thing?
Yeah, well, it's a really hard problem, because sometimes you can talk about it personally. Where I grew up in the New Hampshire seacoast, we all learned to skate outside on ponds. Kids don't do that anymore. They learn to skate in hockey rinks inside because the ponds don't freeze anymore. I'm not that old. People, well, maybe I am, but people still remember, when this was just simply part of the fabric of how kids grew up in those communities. It's not part of that fabric anymore. And so, there'll be a cold year. Everything will freeze. Kids will be playing hockey outside. But that doesn't take away, decades of experience with watching these things change. People who are bird watchers, I don't think I saw a mockingbird until I went to graduate school in New Jersey. Mockingbirds and cardinals are part of the year-round bird fauna in the New Hampshire seacoast now. This is really quite a dramatic change in the natural world that's within it's within individuals' histories. And I think if we can bring out examples like that, then you can start to, you might be able to start to address this issue of, is that flood, was that climate change, or that storm, was that it? Or, oh my God, we had 3 feet of snow, climate change is a hoax.
Dale from the Weather Channel, I wanted to ask, going back internationally, I know in this conference about 3 or 4 years ago, some of the discussions about adaptation started creeping in more than the mitigation and the science part of it. And at the time, something was said that, well, here in the United States and the developed countries, it's obviously going to be much easier to adapt. And the discussion was, well, in Bangladesh and India, where you have, I don't know how many millions or even billions of people living within a couple of feet of sea level and the sea level rise. So I ask you, what kind of, are we seeing anything? Are they doing anything? Or is it started to cause problems yet? I mean, the sea level, it's rose a little bit, it hasn't been significant. What's going on in that part of the world?
Depends on where you are, but Bangladesh has done some interesting things. Nationally, they've set up some funds and raised money internationally for funds that they can manage. They have, USAID has a program of restoring wetlands so that there is natural protection from sea level rise and particularly storm surge. And we've seen through a series of cyclones in the area that with early warning and natural system management, the number of deaths has been brought down over the last few decades. And then comparing Bangladesh with a storm in Myanmar in the last couple of years, we've seen very differential impacts in terms of deaths and people displaced. And that's largely a role of what the Bangladesh government and the country of Bangladesh has done versus other countries. We had as I said during my talk, we had a workshop in the Eastern Caribbean, and there was a discussion of what do we do about the fact that people keep building right on the beach, and then stuff either gets flooded or knocked down during storms. There was a very neat back and forth we were working with a group of stakeholders, and this gets at your question as well. Somebody from one of the countries said we should have zoning laws so that people quit building on the beach. And somebody else said, we have them, and they're not enforced. And somebody else said, well, Barbados has them, and they enforce them. We should learn from them how they're doing it. There's this very neat back and forth, which got at what's getting put in harm's way and why that's happening rather than the impact itself. And so suddenly we had a very rapid fire discussion of how do you bring the human element into this and take on this problem. And so now the program that we're working with those countries on is focused significantly on decision maker education and public awareness. Because then somebody said, well, if we get the government to enforce the zoning laws, they're just going to get voted out by people who don't understand why they're not letting us build on the beach, so we need to educate the public. So there's this back and forth. Different countries are doing different things. We are seeing impacts. It's often one-off things. Storm surge during a storm will be a little bit higher because water levels may be a little bit higher. I've had discussions with the U.S. Navy, who is very concerned about their facilities. As they have said, all Navy ports are at sea level. And so they're concerned about damage to their own infrastructure. And so across the world in different levels of economic development, we're starting to see impacts and we're starting to see responses.
Okay,
Jake,
we have...
Can I get one more in?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, Jay Prater in Wichita, Kansas. We talk about the challenges to both adaptation and mitigation, but one thing that never seems to get mentioned is population growth and how that impacts both of those, and yet that just seems to be one of the many factors, but never seems to ever really be brought up in any of these discussions.
So in our institute, we actually do a lot of integrated modeling that looks at energy issues, economic decision making, population demographic changes, how those influence the emissions of greenhouse gases, how different choices of energy technologies might be used to reduce emissions. And we do that at the same time and with the same group of modelers who also look at questions of adaptation and adaptation decision making and trying to understand the impacts of change in the climate system on agriculture and forestry and water and other natural resources. And the reason that we have it organized that way is that, in fact, as you point out, a lot of these issues are interconnected. And so you can begin to experiment with them and essentially do model experiments that look at alternative scenarios, alternative development scenarios, alternative population scenarios, and start to ask the question, what would be if we are on this path, what would be the consequences? And a lot of our rationale for doing that is not because we're trying to establish policy, but what we'd like to have is the underlying science that enables elected officials and policymakers that they can begin to understand the consequences of being on one direction as opposed to another. And it's our job to kind of provide that scientific engine that allows those sorts of evaluations to be done.
This is a very sensitive issue, both in the countries where we work and in the U.S. People get concerned about, are we running population control programs? So we just largely stay out of it. Typically, as countries develop, as women are brought into the workforce, as they're educated and empowered to make decisions on their own reproductive lives, population growth, fertility tapers off, and population slows. And so there was just an article in the Washington Post a few weeks ago about how Brazil is now, the population growth in Brazil is dropping dramatically. But for political and cultural and religious sensitivities, we kind of have to stay out of it and leave it to the people making the decisions in each country where we work.
Okay, we have a couple of online questions. I'm going to hand it over to Sarah Maxwell so she can ask those.
Okay, thanks, Dave. This question comes from Dan Pope in Salt Lake City. He's wondering if any climate change models are better to incorporate are better able to incorporate ocean deep water temperature, flow change, and future predictions. Thoughts on the modeling?
There's obviously been a lot of advances in climate modeling over the past decade. Part of that is simply better physics and sort of better understanding of the both atmospheric and ocean processes. Some of that is in fact better and more easily available high performance computing, so that the models can actually be run on finer and finer spatial grids, sometimes approaching the kinds of grids that all of you in this room use for weather forecasting. Now, doing that for a climate model is really quite a challenge. All the major groups in the U.S. Pay a lot of attention to this issue of how they represent the oceans, in part because the oceans are slow. In particular, this issue of what happens in the deep ocean. So they're very large reservoirs for heat, but they operate in these very long time scales, which is a challenge for the modeling groups to do. So I guess I would say in answer to this question is that there's sort of a history of progression. I don't know that any one of the groups is really better than the others. There's a major intermodel comparison program that's been going on globally with all the major modeling groups over the last couple of years. A lot of those papers will start to hit the literature within the next 6 months to a year, and then we'll see.
Okay, and a follow-up for you, Dr. Janetos. Would you consider the current bark beetle outbreak as an example of a climate tipping point?
Is it a climate tipping point? It's certainly driven in part by variability in the climate system. It's a tipping point in part because the outbreak has gotten so large that it's now very difficult to figure out how to manage it, and sort of what the next phase is going to be. You don't necessarily want to let all that timber burn up because there's property at risk, and in some parts of the West there'll be lives at risk. On the other hand, it's not clear what you do. Do you do a lot of salvage logging? And so it's become what some people call a wicked problem. It happened very quickly. By the time people really understood what was happening, it was sort of too late to take sort of immediate action. And now the challenge is, how do you manage your way through the transition, which is just a very, very difficult management problem, economic problem, but also scientific problem in trying to figure out what the future really holds.
Jennifer Francis from Rutgers University again. This one's for Tony, and I think some of the new research coming out about how the ecological system is responding to the big changes that we're observing have been absolutely fascinating, and I suspect in some ways having this forcing mechanism has revealed some interactions in the ecological system that we didn't know even existed. One of the ones that I found very interesting has a connection to the Arctic, which is my special interest, and it's this mismatch between species that respond to temperature versus species that respond to the solar cycle. So, for example, there's a bird that flies up to the Arctic to eat a particular caterpillar that hatches according to temperature, but the bird flies according to the solar cycle. So I was wondering if you wanted to say a little more about that sort of a change that we're observing.
One of the things that makes it really difficult to predict or to forecast exactly how all these ecological systems will work. We're used to thinking about ecosystems as though they were sort of units, collections of species. Problem is that they respond differently to different cues. Birds that migrate according to the solar cycle, which isn't changing, the seasonal cycle, which isn't changing, but the prey that hatches out when it's warm, which does change. We really don't understand very well what happens when you get these disruptions in the way that individual species interact with each other. It's a huge challenge.
Okay, I have another question here. It says, and it's getting, I guess, more towards the conversation that we had a few minutes ago on the broadcast meteorologist side, dealing with the U.S. And Europe. Does anybody, perhaps either in the room or up front here, see a different perspective on climate change within the international community compared to the U.S.?
Sure. From my experience, there's less of a debate about is it real, fewer questions of do you believe in it, getting at the issue of is it a matter of faith or a matter of science. Overseas, I go to the UN climate negotiations, and some of my overseas counterparts just are curious about this debate. To them, it's a matter of science, not a matter of you can question the science, but not a matter of, it's not put in terms like, do you believe in it? So I think overseas there's much more acceptance of it.
If I could just add to that, I also think it depends on where you are. If you're sitting in Alaska in the United States, you're going to have a view that's similar to what John just described from Europe. You see the impacts of that warming climate, regardless of cause. You see the impacts. And so they are very prepared to take action, and they don't debate whether it's real or not real. It is what it is, and they want to do something about it. I think you find that in communities, Pacific Island communities. For them, the possibility that their home is going to be gone, that their populations may be gone because of a lack of water even before the sea level rise issue takes them, that's a fundamental issue for them of national security. It's not an issue of what do we do about it in terms of greenhouse gases. They know that they have to decide where their future is because this is real for them, and it's real at a gut and visceral level. And I think you see that, I agree, you see that there's the debate over whether it's real or not is not nearly as strong anywhere else in the world as it is here.
Just so I can add something about the islands, I was talking with a Marshall Islander, and probably a lack of water will cause people to leave some of the islands before they are submerged, as their aquifers are salinated. And I hadn't thought about this, but he pointed out that in international law, an unoccupied island is termed a rock. And then there's questions of where does the economic exclusion zone lie? If there's no one on the outer island and you have a 200-mile or a 10-mile, whatever, economic exclusion zone around it, it starts shrinking. And so there's going to be a lot of these knock-on effects in policy and law that are very interesting that I hadn't thought about, but are kind of fun to puzzle.
John Morales from NBC Miami again. So, John, or perhaps Eileen, would you care to offer an opinion or perhaps knowledge as to why that difference exists? Why there appears to be so much confusion in the United States versus in the rest of the world?
I think maybe I'll stay out of that. Maybe Tony would like to answer it.
I wish I knew why.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think there's been as much study on why that we could say, but I do think that there are issues about the way we've approached it. In some ways, we started with it's an emission of carbon dioxide, kind of a pollution problem. How do we solve the pollution problem? Well, not the political will to do that. So don't make me give up my SUV. Or, yeah. But in reality, we take this open debate of issues pretty seriously in the United States. Certainly the idea that there are always two points of view on an issue. And we often engage in discussions where there's one side that feels the evidence is there and another side that feels the evidence isn't there. And it becomes a debate between two individuals representing what appears to be two equally valid scientific points of view. And we have an issue with figuring out if one of those individuals is speaking from their own personal opinion with no evidence to support it versus somebody speaking with many, many years of science and 200 and some scientists from around the world and agreeing, coming to consensus on what it means. That's a challenge for us, and it's a challenge that we struggle with every day because we often find that the folks who are on the one side that say the evidence isn't there, in many cases where the folks I've dealt with, it is in fact a faith-based decision. Human beings cannot influence God's creation in such a dramatic way. And I found that throughout the Pacific Islands, where they're saying, we can't believe in this, even though we see it, we can't believe in this. And every time I'm on an airplane, it always comes down to, that's hubris, to give human beings to have the sense that human beings can affect God's creation in that way. That's a fundamental issue that we'll never get away from, because that too is visceral. And so we have that issue complicating things as well. Finally, I think in some cases the economic decisions are so scary. The choices of not burning fossil fuels anymore. Europe can, in fact, use a lot more renewable energy, a lot more hydropower, a lot more wind power than we have been able to use in the United States. That's a scary proposition for us, to make a fundamental commitment to renewable energy as opposed to fossil fuels.
John, I think one of the things that there's a lot of social science research at Yale, at George Mason University, that's done a lot of sort of diagnosis, looking at sort of different ways that people perceive the climate change issue, adaptation and mitigation according to educational status, economic status, and so on. It's really interesting research. One of the things that I think we can't lose sight of is how difficult a problem this is. This is way more difficult, in fact, scientifically, economically, politically, than trying to decide to get sulfur dioxide out of smokestacks. And that was really hard. Anybody who, like me, who started their career in the middle of the acid rain debate remembers how difficult that was, and how long it took, both scientifically and politically, to get to a socially acceptable solution. We're talking about effects that last for decades, some of which are irreversible, and possible solutions that involve either long-term infrastructure or restructuring the energy economy. It's hard to imagine an environmental problem that's harder to deal with in all dimensions of this. And so it's not unusual, I think, for people to, for people to sort of wax and wane in how they approach the issue, what's going to work, what are they willing to do, what are they able to do. It's just really a thorny problem from all different perspectives.
Brad Panovich again from NBC in Charlotte. Some of the things that I run into is very similar to what everyone in this room runs into. It's a communication and, I would say, marketing issue. That in the United States, this issue was, I think, presented in a very poor fashion to the public. And not that the people in this room, but the people we work for in our news departments probably have done a disservice to fighting this argument with, basically every heat wave, every weather event has to be labeled caused by X, Y, Z.
Right.
And what's happened in this country is I feel like everybody has to pick one extreme or the other, where I feel the majority of people are somewhere in the middle who are willing to accept there is some culpability of human, but there's also some natural variability And the discussions in this room are great, but these aren't the discussions that are happening in the public square.
Right.
And part of the other reason is most of the most vocal and public speakers on this topic are the non-experts. We have too many politicians, unfortunately, who are the ones doing the talking without the background to back it up, and I think that influences a lot of people. And in my experience, when I actually avoid this subject quite often because I know if I'm in front of a group of my viewers, the minute that word comes up, half the audience is not going to listen to the other half. Everyone's already made their mind up before one word comes out of my mouth, and that's a big problem.
They're not going to watch either.
Yeah, well, afterwards, which is really important for you. One of the studies that Tony was just talking about has been done recently by George Mason University, and one of the things they did is try and stratify people's degree of believing in climate change. And if I'm remembering the study correctly, they actually found that there are 6 Americas. So there are people who feel so strongly that the evidence is there, and you could not convince them that it's not there. There's another tail on the distribution curve, which is it's not real. For whatever reasons they've chosen, it's not real. You can never convince them. And so part of what they're trying to do, and in fact Dave is a part of this endeavor, is to actually figure out, so what's the right communication strategy for each of the other 4 Americas, those that are we don't think the evidence is there, but we're willing to entertain learning, to we're not sure the evidence is there, but even if it is, there's no evidence for it being man-made, and then over on the other side. So in the same way that this is a thorny issue, we also have to realize there are multiple audiences out there, and a lot of times what happens is we end up with the 2 tails commanding the discussion wherever we are, and that makes it much more difficult for you. I do want to just add a little bit to go back to the earlier discussion, which is all related, which is why do we want to attribute one cause, right? I also want to say that I think the communications of climate change as an issue, it's not just the media that's responsible. We all are responsible for the way in which we presented it, and we had a wonderful international example just prior to the birth of the Global Framework for Climate Change and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was stratospheric ozone. And that took a long time to resolve. It took a long time to get people to decide how to fix it, but that was one chemical. And in fact, about the time the stratospheric ozone treaty or the Montreal Protocol for ozone depleting substances was signed, the primary producer of the chemical had already found an alternative that was less dangerous. So suddenly you had industry on board. When you think about climate change, this is not an emission of a pollutant. This is a development choice. And I really believe that in many other countries of the world, they debated it as a development choice or a development threat. And that changes the dynamic of who's at the table, and it changes the dynamic of the dialogue between the individuals at the table. When you cast a problem, any problem, as purely an environmental pollution problem, you resurrect how many decades of us versus them, industry versus environmentalists. We're in the midst of that. We're recovering from that framing of the issue, and I think it becomes really important for us to think about how you frame. So you were saying you just avoid that. So we do too, but you can start by saying what the heck is going on? What are the observations in this place where I'm living and trying to make a living? And then you can say, and what's causing those problems? And you find your way eventually to the climate signal, completely independent of whether it's human-induced greenhouse warming. And I think that's probably the way we need to do this, because until everyone feels a shared sense of opportunity in solving a problem that they're all facing together, we're not going to get past this us versus them choices, and it makes the conversation difficult. So if you frame it differently, you can probably have even deeper conversations than you've had before. At least I find that in my own life.
I think the other challenge, as a communications challenge, there is this large contingent of people who say to the scientists, you have to become better communicators. And that's correct. I mean, I think that's right. but you know, that's not the way any of us are trained, right? We're trained to do experiments or to write models, to try to solve problems, to figure out the way the world works. We're not necessarily trained to understand sort of how communication works broadly. Some people are really good at it, some people not so good, and it's not part of someone's everyday graduate training or postgraduate training. And so I think there is this sort of chasm between a lot of the people who so really understand the nuts and bolts because they're experts, because they've done a lot of research, and then another whole community of people who are talking about the issue rather than talking about the science or talking about real choices. And you guys are right in the middle of that, you know, because you're all trained as scientists and you know, have this sort of marvelous scientific meteorological background. But you know, if I give 30 talks a year, that's only a month for you guys, right? It just means you were on TV 30 times. And so, I mean, there's nobody who has more immediate contact with everyday people on a substantially scientific issue than you do.
And in fact, Dave Jones will know this too, but what prompted this study at George Mason was, if you think about this issue and the issue of communication, isn't the role of broadcast meteorologists a really significant role? Doesn't that community, that bridges between the science and the communication, isn't that community particularly important to the resolution of the issue?
I think what would make all of our jobs easier, I really don't want to be on my phone here.
That seems unfair.
Being this close to Denver, it would make our jobs easier if we could just get Tim Tebow on board.
Yes.
That would help.
Yes.
That would get
That was good. And my name is Rob Marciano from CNN. Just a couple things I want to say. One is that this conference has addressed a lot of things you've talked about over time. As a matter of fact, Ed Maybach was here last year and talked about Six Americas Conference, so we've heard that. I also want to challenge a little bit, Tony, something you said, and maybe get into a little bit deeper, the role of academia and education in helping to create this problem, if you will. Yes, we're trained as scientists, but if we're going to study a problem that has societal implication, shouldn't we also have some training in communication and how human beings work?
So I don't think we're going to have an argument, because I think the answer to that question is yes.
Throwing this softball up for you.
Yeah, then, you know, there are, you know, I went and hit it, and but it's a really different environment than you know, sort of when our generation was in graduate school, you know, or were undergraduates or were in graduate school, where there was a sense, at least in the places that I went, was they were training the next generation of academics, the next generation of researchers, people who were going to go into laboratories and national laboratories and universities and do first-rate science, mostly on whatever interested them. And I think one of the things that's happened, we certainly see it with graduate students and postdocs in our own institution, is that a lot of smart young scientists who will pursue this career now for a different set of reasons. Yes, they're interested in the science. They want to do really good ecology or really good biogeochemistry or really good atmospheric chemistry or physics or climate science. But you know, they're in it because the stakes are high, because there is some societal relevance to it. And I think that's a very, very large percentage of the students that we see, and in fact, some of the best students that we see. That's really one of their primary motivators. And for them, if they're comfortable with being a little bit more in the public eye, then I think some training on how to do that effectively is actually a very good thing for them in their careers. And there are some scientific societies that have entire programs that are dedicated to doing that. There's marvelous programs at AAAS, the biggest scientific society of all that publishes science. We have beneficiaries of some of that program here on the panel. The Ecological Society of America has a whole program for essentially for training scientific leaders to be more effective in communications and in discussions with decision makers and policymakers.
I'll just add to that a little bit. I wouldn't disagree with it either. On the other hand, I don't think that every scientist, even if they're interested in communication, is going to be good at communication. And that's where the partnerships come in. That's why we rely on establishing these relationships with communities of communicators like yourselves and the scientific community. That's why these bridging individuals can play such a significant role, broadcast meteorologists being one of them. What's interesting to me, going back to what's changed, because there are a lot of folks coming out of college now and interested in going to graduate school in this sort of new science and public policy field. When I graduated from the University of Delaware in 1975, I was interested in that field, but I had nowhere to go. Everywhere I wanted to go, marine science being my area of interest at the time, there was one place I could go to college where they were even thinking about the public policy side at a graduate level, and that would have been Rhode Island, and then the University of Delaware, which is where I ended up going, which is now very active in the field. There are a lot more choices for graduate students now to get into this science and public policy arena. It's what got me to where I am today, was this obsession with how you bridge a communication gap between somebody writing legislation, in my case, for fisheries in the Chesapeake Bay, and someone who's doing the science that can inform that legislation. I think there's a lot more opportunities for us to see that cadre of individuals grow.
Let me just point out, interestingly, a lot of times we tend to view this conference as an opportunity for the on-camera folks to learn something about what you are doing. Mm-hmm. And in reality, I think you can attest to this, the structure of the conference is such that you probably learn a lot from them about how they communicate and about the challenges that they have in getting, in doing what they do. And this is what I found to be very valuable about the scope and the size and the direction of this conference is that it's a two-way street.
I couldn't agree more, and that's why I started with the HA. It was in talking with Dave about this summit and how it works and what the process is like that I realized this is as much about us learning from the broadcast meteorological community as it is the science conveying information outward.
Michael Coos, Vancouver, BC. We talk about the climate change debate being a difficult one. I'm finding it's becoming a non-existent one. The climate change debate has slipped to the back pages, and it's all about the economy. And every time a new carbon tax comes into play that was put into the government 6 years ago when the economy was booming, and like, why do I have to pay another 2 cents on my gas per liter? So, how do you battle that economic impact that's going on out there, and that's all anybody's talking about, and they don't want to pay any more for carbon tax?
No. These issues don't go away. Yeah, don't be a chicken, right? So you give me the softball pitch, and now she's going to make me start on the fastball across the outside corner. The issues don't go away. Everybody's everyday issues, whether it's economy or jobs or employment or any other sort of public issue, those will wax and wane in importance on people's agendas according to whole lots of criteria that people have in their everyday lives. This is an issue that, on the other hand, is not going away anytime soon, if only because the changes in the physical environment are not going away. And so I think that in this case, persistence counts, patience counts. We shouldn't expect it to be on the tip of everybody's tongue every time, sort of every month and every year. But there is a long-term nature to this, which is important to appreciate, I think.
I think kind of pulling together a couple of these questions, going back to why is there more acceptance overseas than here, I think and then some of these questions about communication. I think what I see is that the U.S. for so long was seen as the major emitter, the lead emitter. And so we were the ones expected to take on the burden of reducing emissions. It's very easy for a country with no emissions to say that, yeah, you need to do something about this. And so for Americans, that involves all of the economic and cultural and social questions that Tony raised. If we want to really reduce our emissions, there are going to be disruptions. There's going to be costs. There's also going to be benefits. There's going to be winners and losers. How it's communicated, particularly with you guys, I think the way you communicate and the certainty that you communicate with depends on the gravity of the decision that's going to come out of the information you provide and the reversibility of those decisions. I think a lot of time the scientific community seems a little bit mealy-mouthed. You know, we talk about the uncertainties and so forth, but there's a lot of consequence to saying this is what's going to happen 60 years from now, excuse me. You know, don't build on this coast, completely revamp your energy system, do these things. And so because we won't know with certainty what's going to happen in 60 years until we get there, we present it with a lot of, or not we, I'm not really one of them, but I'm a consumer, but the community presents it with the uncertainties and with error bars. And it makes it seem like maybe they don't believe it themselves. But it's not that, it's just trying to lay out all of the caveats that ought to be there. But when you're giving a daily forecast, I imagine that each of you treats what the temperature tomorrow is going to be differently than you do when you're talking about probability of tornadoes. Because if you miss the temperature forecast by a few degrees, people might be uncomfortable. But if you miss a tornado, then there's lives at risk. And so with a long-term decision, I think the caveats that are put in to the public eye when we see certainty about what's going to happen tomorrow or 3 days from now with the weather forecast, then when we're talking longer term, it seems like maybe we don't know what we're talking about, but it's just trying to be honest and open about the uncertainty, because it's a very complicated system that we're trying to talk about. And so I think that maybe undermines it, as well as the cultural issues of how one community communicates or how comfortable you are with communicating.
But I think another point that you raised earlier is absolutely right. I learned more, I think, about how to communicate difficult, sort of scientifically difficult decisions and forecasts with big consequences for people from listening to all the presentations this week about severe storms, and simply every morning on the half-hour weather briefing every morning. I mean, if we could learn, you know, as climate scientists, if we could learn to be sort of half as succinct and clear in as short a time as you guys are really, really good at, we would be doing a lot better, I think, in helping people to understand this whole issue.
And I'll just add one more thing that I think probably is better discussed over liquid refreshment sometime.
I was going to say at dinner.
This evening,
at dinner tonight.
Right, maybe this evening for those of us here in Breckenridge. And that is this issue of uncertainty. We're always trying to talk about how do we convey our uncertainty to the public, to other scientists, to decision makers. Excuse me. My own experience in the case of El Nino forecasting is that they don't actually want to know about uncertainty. They want to know about certainty. They want to know how certain I am that this is going to be a dry, rainy season. And that results, the certainty, conveying certainty versus conveying uncertainty is something that I think deserves a lot more attention and a lot more debate. Because I can tell you that a water utility manager and an electric utility manager in American Samoa stood up in a meeting in Honolulu in '92. And he was listening to a climate forecaster, one of the leading lights in El Nino forecasting, ENSO forecasting. And that scientist kept saying, but these forecasts are not good enough for you people to use. And he said that 5 times, pointing his finger at the audience. Now, we'd structured this meeting to have 2/3 non-scientists in the room, decision makers, and 1/3 scientists. So he's pointing his finger at a group of people saying, you're not ready for this. You have no idea how to use this information. And what he meant by that, he didn't mean anything disrespectful in reality. What he meant is, from his perspective of scientific skill, he didn't think the forecasts were skillful enough for a decision maker to use. And finally, after the 5th time, my colleague Abe Malai stood up and he said, "Do you respect me?"
You're right.
And the scientist said, "Can you repeat that question?" And he said, "Do you respect me?" And he said, "Well, we just met. It's the first day of a conference. And I haven't known you long enough to know if I respect you, but I respect the people who organized the meeting. So let's just say, by extension, I respect you." "Why would you ask me that question?" And he said, "Because it's not your place to decide if this information is usable by me." He said, "Your job is to tell me what you think is going to happen, tell me how certain you are in your analysis, and then trust me to do my job. I use uncertain information every day in every form. It's not your job to tell me that this information about rainfall for my island is not something I can use. You tell me what you think it's saying, you tell me how confident you are, and you trust me to put that uncertainty in the context of my decisions." That little exchange changed the entire dynamic of that meeting, because suddenly it was about listening to the water utility managers, the agriculture interests, the energy folks in the room, in order to figure out, well, how do they make their decisions now? And what are they using about rainfall? And is there some value in this? And of course, in the Pacific Islands, the signal with ENSO is so good. The correlation is so high that to even suggest that it might not have usefulness in the Pacific Islands was kind of silly. But it was a difference in language. He meant scientific skill. And it was that exchange that said, no, that's for you to decide and write papers on. You need to tell me what you think is going to happen. And it's building that trust over time. To come back to what Tony was saying earlier, this is a long-term proposition, and the level of debate will rise and fall over the years, but that requires a long-term commitment on all of our parts to keep engaged in that discussion. Because the reality is you're building trust in probabilistic forecasts. Some of them are going to be right, like we heard about the ENSO cycle this week. Some of them aren't going to be particularly on point. But you have to convey the sense that with a projection into the future, it's the odds that you're looking at, and shaving the odds in one direction or another, which is a decision maker's role. And so I think that we have to be in this for the long haul. And I think that's why building these relationships, which, as we just heard, has been going on for a long time at this summit, this is so important, and why it keeps being part of the discussion at the summit. This is a long-haul decision.
And I would add, you said that was 1992?
Yeah.
I was at a meeting a couple of years ago at the National Academy of Sciences with looking at how to communicate information, and the same thing came up, and a guy from King County in Washington said, you know, we're making decisions, and we can make it with whatever you think the best information is, or we can make it without it. So whatever, 15, 20 years later, we're still seeing this discussion, this debate. And I think that, as Eileen said, bringing these communities together, better understanding of what responsibilities one group has and what information another group has, and how their different processes and their different mindsets operate, can really break down those barriers and get the information flowing better.
Yeah, I should tell you that scientist in '92, he, within 2 years, he stopped improving the models and started spending all of his time talking to citrus growers and peanut growers and others in the context of realizing that all of his models were really useful in the scientific community, but he didn't understand how they were being used outside. It changed his career very late in his career, but it changed his career direction.
Dan Leonard, WSI here. You mentioned earlier, Eileen, I think it was you, that a lot of the third world countries at this point are the primary problem, the major sort of growers in greenhouse gas emissions at this point. How do you resolve, excuse me, how do we resolve this sort of perceived hypocrisy that a lot of the third world countries feel against the developed nations like the U.S.? Obviously, we got to go through that whole industrial revolution and grow rapidly with basically zero concern for the environment. And now we're telling all these third world countries that want to do something similar, grow unimpeded, and saying, no, 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 you guys can't do that. You know, if I'm a leader of one of these countries like India or China, I'm going to, you know, basically say, why should we worry about, you know, whether
the
sea levels rise a little bit when we want to really sort of catch up with the rest of the developed countries. It's not fair to us. You know, we deserve to grow without regard for without having to pay a big price for it like you guys got to do.
That's been the evolving focus of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiations. As a small handful of developing countries become major emitters. And the approach that we have been taking is kind of a process of carrots and sticks. If countries will take a target to reduce their emissions, the developed countries have committed to providing technological and financial support. The view we're trying to move to is that we are all in this together, and that joint action will help all of us. One of the things that I think is weighing on some of those countries and will continue to weigh on their minds is that they are also being affected by these changes. Most of China's economic engine is along those coasts. They are having energy and water concerns now. They're having health concerns from air pollution problems. And so you don't get to emit and then just hand off the problem that it generates and be insulated from it yourselves. And so just like we are dealing with some of the consequences here, they are dealing with them in developing countries. And the 170 or so countries that are not major emitters but are being impacted and are very worried about being affected have a voice at those negotiations and can call out for support. China is still characterized as a developing country, even though I think it has the second or third biggest economy. The Economist has projected that they will pass us by the end of this decade. Their emissions have been growing faster than their economy. But I think one of the things that came out of the meetings in South Africa is that we will revisit over the next few years the types of commitments that different countries will take and try to step away from the characterizations of developed or developing country that were set in place in 1992 and try to look at emissions rather than economic standing 20 years ago, 25 years ago. You want to add to that?
No, it's exactly what I would have said anyway.
Dan? Yeah, Dan again. There's been a debate recently, and I think Ed Maybach and others and Chris Mooney have weighed in on the question of how much of a role in climate skepticism in America is played by excuse me, is played by the lack of, or our rankings in math and science compared to the rest of the world, in the first world especially. Did I make myself clear? You know what I'm saying? Yeah, yes. I mean, we're 29th in science and 32nd in math worldwide. How much of a factor is that in the climate skepticism, or is it more the false balance you see in the media?
You're saying we're more likely to buy swampland.
Exactly.
And expect it to dry out.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a really interesting question. It's hard for me to separate these sort of the kinds of differences you see in how we approach science overall from some of these very deep-seated concerns that people have about different issues in science, evolution by natural selection and climate change being sort of the two of the most prominent. But I always come back to the challenge that we have, I think, as scientists, is that you don't get your own set of facts. There really is, there really are a set of data, ways that we understand those data, and ways that we, in a sense, self-regulate through peer review how our knowledge actually increases that demonstrably works. And after that, it's hard to know what influence, all the things that influence how people perceive that.
A lot of the places where I work do not rank above the United States on math and science scores, and yet there is a stronger belief that something is happening. They may not have the vocabulary that we use to talk about chemical changes in the atmosphere and so forth, and emissions and so forth. But they understand that something is happening, and part of that is because they're seeing it, they're feeling it, they talk to their grandparents who planted on a certain day and things are changing. It may be manifested by when certain bugs appear or when certain other environmental changes take place. I think part of that comes from, a lot of times when I give a talk to a different audience, I start by asking, how many of you work outside? How many of your livelihoods are affected by the weather? Now, all of you, your livelihoods depend on the weather to a certain extent. So I didn't ask it today, but in the US, you ask that, particularly in a group of either government or private sector NGO workers, nobody's hands go up. A lot of us work in offices where we have to call someone to find out whether it's raining outside or not. When you, what's that? Or we could look at the internet, or now our phones. Yeah. Or now we can look at our phones or get online. But it's not, we're not out there in it, and it doesn't really matter. If you're sitting at a desk working on a computer, unless it's something really dramatic, it doesn't affect your ability to get through the workday. If you see a storm like the one in Niger that I put the picture up of, and you're a farmer and you're living in a hut, everything you own could get washed away. All of your assets that you carried over from the previous year, not in the form of a bank account, but in the form of seeds, can get washed away. If you borrowed money to buy seeds or fertilizer and that gets washed away, then you're really in trouble. And so the way that it affects you, I think, affects your attitude towards the issue. And in the US, we are very lucky that we're a huge country. If something terrible is happening in one part of the country, the rest of the country is usually unaffected and can help that part recover. And those structures simply aren't in place in the very poor parts of the world. And so there's much more of a feeling that the individual is on his or her own. And so an understanding of what's happening is very prevalent in their minds because it's happening right to them, unbuffered.
It's kind of interesting to me. Basically, that maybe the reason for the skepticism then in America is that our lifestyles are environmentally insulated.
Yeah, we have heat, we have air conditioning. If everyone in America were affiliated with the ski industry and all of America had 5 years like Colorado's and Lake Tahoe's up to last week or a couple days ago, I think it'd be a much more prevalent thing. And when 70, 80, 90% of the population depends on agriculture, and it's rain-fed agriculture, they don't have irrigation, versus in the United States where it's 1 or 2%, then we are buffered from it. We're insulated from it.
That's all right. Matt Safino, Portland. Eileen, your story about your 92 conference reminded me of questions that we all get as broadcasters. Questions like, is my son's soccer game going to go on today? Or can I drive over the pass? And I get that question, I'm thinking, I don't know, how good of a driver are you? What kind of car do you have? Are you prepared to be stuck if you don't make it? What do you know, I mean, all of these things. So that's my initial thought process when I get that question, but I know that's not what they don't want me to ask them that question. They want to know how much snow is there going to be, when's it going to fall, how bad's it going to be. And so, we give them information to help them make their decisions. But the climate change question is a lot more difficult, as you two have very, very excellently communicated to us. But it's kind of the same approach. It's like, and when I take that approach and let them know what I think and what I know or what my opinion is, then they seem to go away a little bit more satisfied. Because then it lets them make decisions in their own opinions. But it's interesting when you get those questions. Can I drive over the pass? I don't know. What kind of car do you got?
Do you have snow tires or chains? Right. Yeah, I don't know. But that the creation of that partnership between the person asking the question, the person answering the question, that partnership is what's important. And by answering the question the way you answered it, you're essentially empowering the individual to take the information you've given them, and then they get to decide, and they choose based on what you said to them. I think that's a really important lesson for all of us, is to realize that this is not an absolute. I have my own take on the issue of the science and math scores. I also think that the way we teach science historically has been one that there is the absolute answer, which goes back to the first question we had, which is, I want to attribute this thing, this event, to one thing, because there's a single absolute answer, because that's what science is. Whereas we all know science is solving mysteries all the time, and you're never going to have an absolute answer to that question. So I do think that there's some relevance to how we teach science and math, whether or not we're 29th in the world or not. It's how we teach it that I think is important. But I also think that it's about developing these relationships so you know how to answer that question now through experience. That goes back to what John was saying. If everybody lived in a ski resort, they'd have a lot of experience. Well, we also, as scientists, need to value that local knowledge and experience that isn't always documented in a scientific way or published in scientific journals. There's a rich amount of information in what a local person has experienced, and that we can bring that into our discussion about what's changing and what it means to us. And we don't do that as well as we could do as a scientific community, I don't think.
Just kind of interesting, John, what you were talking about. Oh, wrong one? I have one. Okay. Oh, it's Cindy Presser from St. Louis. My dad has been a farmer in southeastern South Dakota for 79 years. And when I talk about climate change with him, he has seen it change. He's growing different crops now than he used to, but he still will not accept climate change. Those are the type of the people that are very difficult to deal with, because he knows, he sees it himself. He's doing things very differently, but still he just feels this is God's will. This is the way it is. So that's what you deal with as well. Yeah. With him it is. Yeah.
Well, that's one of the 6 Americas that Eileen and Tony mentioned.
Yeah.
And the advantage that your dad has is the flexibility to change his crops, to change his behavior. And in very poor countries, there may not be access to either the credit required to buy crops or just other seed varieties. So, but yeah, that's one of the challenges, is that it's just that I can't quite tip over and say that something's really happening, even though I'm responding to the changes.
Well, this has been terrific. I'd like to take a moment here to give all our panelists a round of applause.
Can we do a round of applause for
Yeah, these guys are great.
A round of applause for the participants in the room as well.
Is largely because of them.
Yes. It's so important to bring together the scientific community and broadcast meteorologists, and that's exactly what the Weather and Climate Summit does, and exactly what Glenn Gerberg wanted to happen 25 years ago, and that's why it's called the Glenn Gerberg Weather and Climate Summit here in Breckenridge. And so, you know, we're really pleased to have the expertise that we have here on the panel. Those of you who have online questions, we're really sorry that we didn't get to them, but we will ask the panelists these questions and try to get you some answers online, so we don't ignore you. We certainly feel your questions are good and they're important, and we also wanted to get to the questions of the broadcast meteorologists here in the room. So that does it for this afternoon. We will not have the 1:30 question and answer session because this was an interactive discussion period this afternoon. But please join us tomorrow as we wrap up the 2012 Weather and Climate Summit when we have Jennifer Francis talking about the Arctic paradox, and we also have Jim White from University of Colorado talking about all sorts of things, including Greenland and how fast things are changing. So if you take a look, we also want to acknowledge Image Audio Visuals for their provision of the cameras, of the set up front here with the drape and the curtains, and also the monitors that we're using here. The production overall is being done by the crew from Storm Center Communications, and we think it's all coming together rather well. A lot of great comments from you online. We really appreciate that. So we look forward to seeing you tomorrow from here in beautiful Breckenridge, Colorado, where we had 3 to 8 inches of snow yesterday. So it was a beautiful, beautiful day. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you tomorrow.